Good morning, all, from a rather chilly Johannesburg. Um, Super honored and excited to be your host today and to be opening up this event. It's really heartwarming to have you all with us today, as we are going to be having a critical decision on a topic that I hold very dear to my heart, a topic that we as Kanye also feel is critical in unlocking the full potential of our African continent. It's our time as Africa to make sure that we reach our top and full potential. Before we start, I'd like to ask you all just to complete a poll to get your perspectives on today's session. Thank you.
Hi all. Apologies for the technical challenges we just faced with our load shedding. We will be back online in a minute. Thank you.
Okay, Theo, please proceed. Thank you. Theo, hi Theo, can you hear me? If you could please proceed.
Great. I understand we're all online. So before we start, we'd like all of you to complete a poll. The poll will be going up shortly, and will take just about 3 minutes. Thank you.
Theo, you're back on. If you can continue, I can remove the poll that you'll.
Great. I'm so happy to see that we've got quite a lot of belief in how we can influence inclusion going forward. So apologies again for the small technical challenges we had at the beginning. I think we fortunately have ironed out all the gremlins in the system. So once again, welcome to today's session and good morning to you all from a rather chilly Johannesburg, I must say. As we get into the conversation, I'd like to just sketch out a scenario that I think is very interesting to take into consideration as we move into the conversations of today. Earlier this year, Khani hosted a Global International Women's Day event where we unpacked the importance of delivering on our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we must make sure that as we move forward, that we remove all the biases that we see on our African continent and ensure mass participation in the growth and development of our continent. But for this to happen, and for us to address all these biases and to move forward, we need to ensure that the population of Africa is well educated on, in particular, for today's conversation, financial literacy. Please note that this is not the only area that we need to focus on, but there are a number of other levers. But this is a critical conversation to have if we want to unlock the potential of the continent. We can make a meaningful difference by doing more than just ticking the boxes, which it appears to have happened in the past. We need to make sure that financial inclusion leads to the empowerment of our people, and that through education, that we involve everyone in transacting and making sure that we are not just ticking boxes, but we make sure that everyone has a role to play in economic activity. What do I mean by this? Right? Picture a scenario in the not so distant future, where you have a young lady who's working in one of the biggest markets in Ghana, the Makota market, for example. She has a thriving business. She's selling shea butter or any other product for that matter. And as she's trading one day, she pictures in her mind what it would be like to actually import or to export her goods and serve the whole continent, not just the thriving market that she's in. As she ponders this, a young man approaches her store and asks her if she has ever thought of exporting her product to other markets as he's buying one of her containers of shea butter. She says, "What a coincidence. This is exactly what I was thinking about as you were coming to my shop. But I was thinking there's a number of areas that really complicate the matters for me. And I was just thinking to myself, how would I get new customers? How would they pay to me? How would I move my product to them efficiently, smoothly, and effectively? How would I be able to buy my stock? Are there regulations that I need to consider as I export my product into other markets?" All of this seems rather complex for me, and I'd really like your guidance if there is anything you can help me in moving this forward. The young man says, things are moving and things have changed. We have now recently, as Ghana, and together with other countries, have signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which most African countries believe is the way forward in terms of boosting our intertrade amongst African countries. We've got all the tools necessary to help us to make this a reality. And as I think about this, I'd like to offer you a couple of insights into the tools that you could use to make sure that you take advantage of this massive opportunity. But before I take too long on this scenario, and before I take up the whole show, we don't have that much time, I'd love to hand you over to one of our senior advisors here at Khani, a lady by the name of Joanne Pohl, who's going to be our MC for today. And she has brought with her, and we'll be discussing a lot of these topics with a panel of incredible experts that I have had the privilege to meet, some of them at least, who are really going to give us more insight into financial inclusion and how that, combined with education, can unlock the potential of the country. Jo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Theo. Well, first of all, having painted that picture, it's no wonder that 2 decades of consulting experience see you as the co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Regional Business Council for Africa, as well as a founder member of the African Growth Platform. It's a privilege to share the stage with you. And welcome again to all. I think having a poll come just after the poll demonstrates some of our resilience on a technical glitch. So glad all of those pieces are sorted and looking forward to an engaging session today. Speaking of how time flies as we now move it very squarely into the second half of the calendar year, it's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with Business Engage and the 30% Club for over a decade now. Their commitment to fostering meaningful change and how, together with the members, we aim to uplift and develop a diverse pool of talent has really set the platform for us to build African role models for Africa and beyond. We're going to keep having the right conversations and instilling a call to act and supporting actions that are impactful for so many. This speaks to the alignment with our own values as Carney, and it is a pleasure for Carney and Business Engage to co-host this Africa panel this morning. How apt is Theo's starting point at Ghana by lines of latitude and longitude, literally the center of the world. So here we go, Africa. It's time to start to find new ways of working, not just post, or rather almost post the pandemic. The fact that we've lived through the devastating effects of that globally, the war in Eastern Europe, unprecedented inflation rates, and notably a shift in economic powers. We are living through 1 in 100-year events that are happening in the space of 3 years, if not less. Still, we have seen the resilience and the heart of people. We've seen that hope fuels curiosity, and that in turn ensures there's optimism. So now it's about Africans and the opportunities we unlock as a collective. Today, we're going to unpack those opportunities, not just what could be, but what's actually been realized. We want to ignite a fire inside you and a call to action. It's about how we create an environment whereby education and financial inclusion are the norm for individuals, for our communities, for society at large. It's about Africans solving problems for Africa and helping shape the world. And we do that well, but not alone. We do that with the power of a collective. And here it's about collaborating. As the African proverb goes, a single bangle doesn't jingle. So today it's about making music together and hopefully get your toes tapping towards what that means going forward. We are supported by several business leaders today, and thank you so much for joining us to share your inspiring stories, the programs of what you've done, and the impact you've made. It makes me think of Iris Bonet's book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design. Today, we're talking about inclusion by design, deliberate acts and actions that have taken place. So sit back, relax, enjoy the storytelling, learn so that how we live going forward is different. There will be Q&A time, so to all the studio audience, we'll definitely pick up your comments, your shout-outs, and your questions. Of course, there'll be time for a leg stretch. And so before we kick off, just make sure you know how to navigate the platform, that as you've come through the lobby, completed our word search, given your all in the poll, that you do make comments and ask us questions. It's about the conversation now, and that will happen long after this morning. And so I want to start the first tranche of this section. We're going to talk about education and then financial inclusion, and then the combination of both and what they enable. So I'd like to start the education piece where we really think about learning differently with a quote from Nelson Mandela to set the tone. Education is the great engine of personal development. It is through education that the daughter of a peasant can become a doctor, the son of a mine worker can become the head of a mine, and that a child of farm workers can become the president of a great nation. Education gives children, our youth, the disadvantaged, the knowledge and skills to face everyday life, overcome everyday challenges, and take advantage of economic and lifelong learning and the opportunities these unfold. It's a key driver for reducing poverty, fostering economic growth, and achieving gender equality and social development. To elaborate on this, we have our very own homegrown entrepreneur, who in his own words believes that education is the most impactful tool to change your and your community's economic circumstances. A warm welcome to Melvin Lubega, the co-founder of GoOne, a company that commits itself to providing the best learning opportunities to improve lives through education and training. Melvin, you have the Spotify of education. And not only that, you're a South African unicorn, referred to as a reference thought leader and an invited speaker both locally and internationally on digital transformation, disruptive innovation, the future of the workforce, business strategy, and more. It is a pleasure to have you share the floor with us. Plus, you're the first African to win the Lindis accolade in December 2021. Dream crazy, scale up, and pay it forward. That's a lot for one person to shoulder. Tell us about it all started. Tell us where did it go, how did Go One actually come about?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Joan. A really humbling introduction, and really grateful to be part of this important conversation. I think education and financial inclusion are such important levers for economic growth, and so it's something which we witness as well. For myself, personally, I'm very passionate about solving significant problems that face our society with technology, and education is one such challenge. And it's quite interesting, just reflecting on the pandemic, as you mentioned, where technology is meant to be a lever for inclusion, and more so in education, what we do at Go One, and I'll share a bit about our journey there. But I think what the pandemic actually showed us was also where it can also, almost make the disparity even starker. If you think about a school during the pandemic where private school had to sit at home and fall further behind on curriculum. And so it's interesting how technology can be both a lever for good and not necessarily helping its own cause, depending on the context. And I think it also speaks to the fact how I think as a continent, as a country, there's certain fundamentals we need to address when thinking through how we leverage technology, both in the workplace and in society more broadly. I think to your direct question, I've had the privilege of probably today, working across 30 countries as you built out our business at Go One. And really what you come to appreciate is that the many issues that societies and countries face in relation to education, technology, and some of those bigger topics really aren't necessarily different. I think different levels, different scales of evaluation, but what you often find the principal elements are still the same. And so ultimately for us, when we began building out Go One, it was a function which was based on our own lived experiences, which I'll share, but also when one realizes that your experiences aren't necessarily, let's call them unique to our experiences. So just to take a step back and, probably take it back to then 2014, 2015, when we began the business, it was really born out of our experiences as young people, thinking through how do we get opportunities to upskill and grow ourselves in our roles and add value in our particular contexts. And the biggest thing we struggled with was if we looked to necessarily enabling us to actually add value in our workplaces, but in the same vein, in certain workspaces, we won't feel like we were getting enough of that professional development and upskilling. And this is true across many of our peers. I mean, one of our early investment businesses, we invested in a payments company in South Africa called Yoco, which I'm sure does amazing stuff in financial inclusion, which we'll chat about. But even the entrepreneurs there, speaking to the colleagues and partners, was again where small businesses felt they couldn't afford to invest in upskilling their staff. Yet one would argue that it's the small businesses that needed most to be able to almost compete with the bigger businesses. If I fast forward to my brief time in management consulting, similar vein, where you found that some of the largest organizations in the world were still struggling to actually upskill their staff for the future. And so it comes down to the point of if those who are small aren't getting it right, it's too complex for them, and those who are big organizations feel they can't necessarily nail it when it comes to learning, how do you bridge that divide? And that really was the driver behind our journey at Go One. To your point, how do you help people unlock a positive potential through a love for learning? And so for us, it was really about how do we build the simplest interface for an individual or an organization to, one, find, book, deliver, and track all their training in one ecosystem, which ultimately led us to what is Go One today, where we five for education. But really it comes down to what role does education enable someone to do more? And I think, to your point, probably the most powerful tool one can have in enabling them to reach their full potential and live a life of their meaning. And so squarely what we do on the Go One side of things is almost doing that. And so I guess through the various titles you mentioned that I hold, it's really been saying, how do we take our experience of working with governments and clients around the world around helping them unlock their positive potential that enables us to think through how do we then take that experience and help other organizations on that journey?
Thank you, Melvin. I think not only inspiring if you think about your beginnings. I've also been the recipient, or rather the user, of one of your Yoko handsets. My daughter has a little business. It was interesting. It's the first day she's been able to command the full use of her father's cell phone because it had to be connected to a machine. But I love what you've enabled. You've made it real because of the fact that it was so relevant to your own life. And there was a recent post actually on LinkedIn for Go One that really resonated with me. It said, can we increase our empathy and emotional intelligence by understanding our brains better? And there was a resounding yes. So education and access to it can definitively change the world and how we show up. And I suppose with that focus of where you've come from, I think if I remember the stories you told me around sitting, in a room with 3 friends and globally, changing something through an idea that's gained incredible traction, is the focus on solving a global issue that had local relevance. Tell me a little bit more about your proudest metric. I know you don't often share it, so I'm pushing you to share a little bit of blowing our own horn to some degree, how you've partnered to enable that and to actually scale it, because you've impacted individuals, you've impacted organizations, and you've worked across the spectrum. So please share.
No, and I think, when my partners and I really came together to build the business, what brought us together beyond our friendship was this common cause around the power of education. And so, you briefly mentioned, when we were sitting in our then kitchen/office, thinking through exactly how we build something that can actually champion a global issue that we're passionate about in terms of unlocking potential through a love for learning. And so in our journey, so we began the business in 2015. There were 4 of us around the table, flashing our minds, and I was probably procrastinating instead of doing my master's dissertation, trying to call clients in the early days. But, going from where we are now to, having 650 people around the world, really building that out. But ultimately, to unlock positive potential, it is about thinking about that scale. And so, we say internally that, we want to reach 1 billion learners. And so for us, we only reach, about 5 million today. So we've got a long way to go in that journey. But when we think about the richness of learning, our most proudest metric, and I think you you alluded to it, is the fact that, so as an actuary, I really love numbers. And so, every 1.3 seconds, someone around the world actually starts a course on the Go One platform. And for us, that's particularly proud because it speaks to the point of, one, the skill we've been able to achieve as a business leveraging technology, but more so the impact we're able to have in helping people on their journey to unlock their potential through a love for learning. And so for us, it's really about saying, yes, it's day one, but we're very proud to celebrate how far we've come on that journey as we progress.
Thank you. I'm going to be silent for just 1.3 seconds so people can realize how impactful that is. That's it. Someone just completed one of your courses. That's amazing. Thank you, Melvin. We'll definitely bring you up again a little bit later to share more of your experience and your stories. And no doubt from a Q&A, we'll also see a couple of things. Education is definitely going to unlock what we can do on this continent and beyond. With that, I think you've shown that passion and knowledge, we all have the power really to uplift. And it's not just about starting small, but about dreaming big. But not just the small person, or rather the individual, can make a difference. We've also seen corporations do that. So I hand over from you, Melvin, and introduce Charmaine to really talk through us through what bigger corporations can do. Cisco. So Charmaine, you're a senior director at Cisco, plus the AI and data country chair for the G100 Mission Million, which I'm loving. I'm learning all of these new things about these missions and literally a calling across the continent. But you've worked with Cisco, who has a purpose to empower an inclusive future for all. Plus, it's very much aligned to the passion at Cisco and your powerful innovation that you have at your fingertips. You've got some incredible programs around how global technology has really enabled spaces, and corporations of your size have left your footprint across the region, not only with your specializations from a technology perspective, but also the markets you've identified, gone into, and really helped ensure that lives are made better for all. So when we first spoke, you talked to us about digital savvy individuals, the digital skills uptake, and that how limited it was and what it looked like in terms of making a difference, and that you had to work with partners, with governments, not just here in Africa, but globally to really make that happen. To name a few, you had the Networking Academy, Global Classroom, etc. But if I go on, I might just steal your thunder. Please share with us the information around or a little bit more around what Cisco has been doing to create a digitally aware population. What does that actually mean, and how did you go about it?
Thank you so much, Joe. So I think you've encapsulated all of the work we do so beautifully. And again, I think one of the areas that we're very clear on, and you've mentioned it, is how do we actually collaborate and partner? Because very early on in the process of our establishment across the continent, we believe that no one person or institution can do it alone. We actually do indeed need a village. And one of the areas that I believe we have been quite successful in is in terms of just partnering with governments to better understand their digital adoption journey. And interesting to me is that every time I meet with the head of state and I ask them, what is your number one priority in terms of moving your country forward when you look at digital and socioeconomic impairments and issues that you need to address? And the very first thing they always say is we want to build digital natives. We want to ensure that not just from the citizen perspective, but even from the public sector perspective, that we do drive digital adoption. And I think, you always have all of these conversations around how do we maybe limit or how do we intervene in terms of digital adoption and acceleration. And for Cisco, we're trying to figure out, how do we repurpose instead of slow anything down? So through our networking academy, which we have, it's actually, as you say, a global classroom. And if I just come closer to home in terms of South Africa, we've been in country now for 20 years. We've been fortunate enough to work with close to 151 partners who drive this digital acceleration and digital training. We have some remarkable partners like the ITU, the African Union, and a host of other establishments in government, like the Department of Education and Training. We recently just concluded an MOU with the Ministry of Women, People with Disabilities, and the youth to also start to pick up and drive this digital adoption. Because we actually do believe that, if you have it and you are tracking it and monitoring, then how can we assist you just in terms of leading? And we saw, especially Joe, during the pandemic, we saw that cybersecurity was a real issue. It was something that many countries, many citizens like you and I, and even many governments were hard hit by cybercrime. So one of the areas that Cisco Networking Academy is leading in is in terms of ensuring that we build a large network of cybersecurity experts and specialists. And interestingly enough, when we look at the high level of unemployment, this is an area actually in terms of cybersecurity where we still have the lowest skills rate and adoption rate in terms of training. So this is an area that we're working globally to actually address, just in terms of ensuring that we build these digital natives in the public sector and of course then just across ordinary citizens as well. Something else which we've actually been quite focused on is in terms of entrepreneurship training. We've recently opened our latest Cisco Innovation Center in East London, where we partnered with various governments as well as public and private sectors, where we're actually bringing in entrepreneurs to start understanding what does it mean to be digitally savvy? How do they build digital inclusion in their entire sort of scope of work? So again, the Cisco Edge Centers is something that's taken up quite strongly at the Innovation Center in Pretoria, one in East London, another one down at the Dubai Trade Port Center, and we're in the process of opening another one down in Cape Town. So all again, I think, Joe, in terms of driving and building an inclusive digital agenda adoption.
Sure, I think no mean feat. And if you talk about cybersecurity, being so conscious of what it means for your personal identity and beyond that, the opportunity to create jobs that will continue to scale, I think speaks volumes. However, you haven't only made a difference in South Africa. Across the continent, Cisco's had an impact. Tell me how many of those learning centers you have and how many countries you're actually in terms of the impact around what this feels like with a global focus, but actually a local impact.
So we've been quite fortunate, actually. I mean, during the pandemic, we reached out to many governments across the continent and even globally, and we offered them the Cisco WebEx services. And we said to them, would you like to remain connected with your citizens as well as just in terms of staying connected with each other. And then also through Networking Academy, we were quite fortunate to sign up a number of institutions as well. So in South Africa alone, we with 151 partners, and just this year alone, we've trained 24,500 individuals in terms of Networking Academy. And that's just like for the year. We're not even talking about in terms of what we've done for the past 20 years. We're currently in 45 countries across the continent, which we refer to as Africa Velocity countries. And then if you include countries like South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, we're actually sitting in 48 countries where we have these centers. And again, the Networking Academy centers don't belong to Cisco. What we do is we work in partnership with an entrepreneur, and we just look at the basic requirements of, do you have access to broadband? Do you have access to some sort of digital devices through which you can deliver the learning? And then we provide the content free of charge. So we actually give out the content. And in certain instances, if you are an NPO, you can actually reach out to us. And then we actually look at how do we even set up the infrastructure and equipment for you so that you are able to deliver the learning. So Joe, we find that there's employment on various aspects. So employment from running one of the academies and owning it as your own, but also employment in terms of bringing on lecturers and people who are actually trained. We train them to actually deliver the learning and deliver the content. And from a third perspective of also ensuring that once you're very familiar with the course content, how do you then actually become a sort of reseller, resupplier of a lot of the Cisco sort of end user equipment. So again, employment coming in from various aspects and various channels in the 48 countries across the continent.
Sure, I think Cisco lives Aristotle's rule of three, right? Things work better in threes, and you've created an ecosystem that really will help generations to come, not just those that are currently impacted by what it is you're doing with the technology, but the fact that you've enabled through not-for-profit a gain. And I always like to say, although not-for-profit, it's definitely for gain, and it's gaining momentum and traction. 89% hit rate, 48 out of 54 countries is impressive. The numbers person in me, if I had to think about every 1.3 seconds qualifies on the Go1 platform, and you've got now, a sweet mix around 89% of the countries touched by the work you do. So in classroom, creating digital savvy and tech savvy people, and then online, we see that education gaining momentum. It really is impressive around the number of lives that are going to be changed by the work an entrepreneur has done and created in the work you are driving through the Cisco platform. I'll bring you back for some questions. Don't go far.
Awesome.
But that really is appealing, especially the number of partnerships you have and the fact that actually collectively we can do more as a village. Love that piece. Yes. Which brings me then, I'm going to bring Jola on. And we're going to talk a little bit more again about what's possible in terms of the next steps. Jola is the head of brand and reputation for Google Sub-Saharan Africa. Recently, actually, Jola, you contributed to a piece by the IFC as an industry expert, specifically about online learning, and that for women, what that can do in terms of expanding opportunities. I think making the art of the possible real definitely sits in your realm. So if you sit back and you listen to what Melvin has said and done, what Charmaine has said and done, it's really important that we have this and done piece in the theme. Sharing success stories has definitely fueled how we move forward. And it warms not only our hearts, but it warms our feet to keep going and get up and step in. And I suppose the fact that even the piece that you had in the business day more recently or earlier this year, where you talked about things that are close to your heart and your passions, that's for SMEs and gender equality and the ability for tech to enable that. Another number that resonates with me is Google's pledge to train 10 million people across Africa in digital skills. So how have you enabled this access to information and educational tools? How can it be done? What should we Google to get there, to understand the pieces that we are not aware of, but that we can compellingly leverage and utilize to make a difference across the region?
Thanks so much. Really glad to be here. So you're right. Let me start with the IFC research that was recently released and was done also in collaboration with Coursera. And it found that, one of the key stats that stood out to me as a result of that was the fact that, we keep saying that gender equality is everyone's business, but this really brought it to light because it also, it said, it had to put within 5 years, the online learning market, if we close the gender gap, could actually increase by $14 billion. So within 5 years. So it was not just kind of presenting the fact in terms of what we should do to kind of increase access to women learning online, but it was also saying this is good business. This is money on the table. And when you look at online learning, the online learning landscape, women are learning online for many reasons, right? So part of it is mobility, part of it is security, part of it is also, just the traditional things, right? They have things to juggle, they have responsibilities at home, things that they want to, other things that they're trying to juggle in addition to kind of picking up skills and things like that. Now, when we think about how we've done this at Google and in the course of my work at Google, you talked about our digital skills initiative where we pledge to train 10 million Africans on digital skills. And so far, we've trained over 6 million Africans on digital skills. I'm glad to say that over 48% of those are women. And people typically ask me, how do we do this? How do we ensure that we kind of include gender equality in our programs? How did we get, 48% of women that we've trained to be, 40% of the people that we train to be women? And what I always say is, I like this quote that basically says, if you don't intentionally include and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude. So I think that's kind of the basis. I'm not sure if I'm online.
You're good. I think
Okay.
we're just listening in awe.
Okay. Yeah. So if we don't, as I was saying, like if you don't intentionally and proactively include, you unintentionally exclude. And, that is kind of the bedrock of how we basically, the philosophy of how we basically work on gender equality on our program is, really thinking about it from the get-go. First of all, understanding the gap, really being deliberate and committed, to it, right? So in our planning, be it in our measurements, being in the way that we brief our agencies, these are things that we are proactively and intentionally including. And so the results speak for themselves, right? Because we're measuring our success, not just by the fact that we're training, millions and millions of Africans on digital skills, but by the fact that there is equality or equity in our training programs. And that again, really speaks to my passion around, women in general. And we also know that on the African continent, women, or the African continent, really contributes to the sheer number of entrepreneurs globally. So African women tend to be like the entrepreneurs, right? So tend to be like the ones that are really turning ideas to impact. And so when you think about what women are learning for, so they're learning to grow their careers, but a lot of women are also learning to just basically grow businesses. So there's a lot of work that we do as well in that area, really helping women to build the skills necessary to grow their businesses. And one of those areas is the Hustle Academy. One of the programs that we work on, that is the Hustle Academy. The Hustle Academy is basically a 5-day boot camp. It's an online boot camp where we bring businesses together, and we help them to look at their businesses, not just from like their strategy, but also their financials, also their technology enablement, and ultimately help them to put their business together in a way that they're investor ready, so that they can grow their business, they can get more funding, and they can grow their businesses. We find that a lot of women are, again, in tune or like generally lean towards some of these programs, because as I said, African women are, a lot of them are learning to grow businesses rather than growing careers, just because of the sheer nature of our continent. So those are some of the things that we've done. You also asked that I share around, some where can you find some of this information? So I mean, if you go to some of our website, and I'll put it in the chat as well, g.co/digital skills. All our training programs, a lot of training programs are on there. Some of our certificate programs are on there as well as g.co/Hustle Academy, which is basically what I just described, our program for small businesses, helping them to build the right skills for them to be able to grow and be investor ready.
I love that. And I think what's really key is the opportunity to hustle, to be part of that 14 billion in 5 years. I mean, that's a compelling call to action, to get into action and to move forward. I think, Jola, having had the privilege of speaking to you and hear your story and the Google story in more detail, the drive to unlock economic opportunity, how you support entrepreneurship, job creation, education, gender equality is evident. And I suppose the question I have is, how does that then, if we've now looked at SMEs and women, in terms of some of the youth programs that you have, can you talk to us a little bit about those and what's actually been done on the ground that we've got access to as well?
Yeah. So in terms of the youth programs, quite a lot has been done. I talked about our digital skills initiative. One that is also really close to my heart is our Google Career Sets initiative as well. And this is basically a program where you can learn a lot of in-demand skills. So think about things like project management, UX design, data and analytics, IT support, digital marketing. And you can kind of learn these programs on the go, self-taught by yourself, or self-paced rather, by yourself, and within a 6 months period. And you basically have the skills to kind of start a career in any of those fields. So that's one that is also really, really close to my heart. We offer, the programs are not free, so they're available on Coursera. However, on an annual basis, we've consistently offered scholarships to enable people to take on this program via partners. We've offered over 10,000 scholarships today for people to be able to take on this scholarship. Some of the, I will share the link in the chat, but some of this, so people can reach out to the partners and so that they can take advantage of the scholarships.
I love the fact that you're creating an enabled environment, and actually the opportunity to take that up is then up to the individual that's watching this, looking at it, doing it differently. I think it always works both ways. You have the right to education, but also a responsibility to harness what is out there. Thank you, Jola. We'll bring you back in. We've got some questions already in the chat, so I'm actually going to go to those. Now I'm going to bring up all three of our panelists on screen, if that's okay. So Melvin, we'll have you back. Charmaine and Jola, good to share with all of you in the same space. Thank you. So I think what's key for us here is that education is very definitely the bedrock of social and economic development. It's probably one of the most crucial investments in our key asset across the continent, or our key resource, and we are resource rich in Africa, but our people is what really makes us very unique in that bucket. And I suppose, so I'm going to go to the first question, and it's going to go out to you, Melvin. So I hope you're ready to rock and roll off the back of that. It's Gowan. Great. Gowan covers education in the workplace. That's really amazing. And you can see it reaching that billion soon. I love that. But how do you make sure that you're ahead of the pack, as there are other existing course platforms as well? So what is it you do differently at Gowan? The audience wants to know.
Yeah. The funny thing is, if you ask one of my biggest differentiators at Gowan, yes, we use numbers, machine learning, we've got nice products, we partner with some of the best technology companies in the world, and fortunate to have them as our investors, such as Salesforce and Microsoft. But I would argue our secret sauce is actually in our people. I would argue that we have some of the best people in our team than many other companies I have come across. And so really that is our edge. And I think, it's taking people and ultimately the problem you're trying to solve and merging those two together. And I think what gives us the edge is we really focus on how do we have a deeper understanding of the problem better than anybody else in the world. Because we believe by deeply understanding the problem we're solving and actually how it's affected in our customers, in the organizations that we serve, we're then able to come up with a better solution. And so it's by no means a static point in time, but it's about that obsession with how do we add greater value to our customer that will set us apart. And I think that's about a lifelong moat more than at a static point in time.
I like that. So basically, this is not a once-off at all. Every single time you do something, it's about gathering momentum. And I suppose they said the old, I think in the 1600s, they said practice makes perfect. You are all about progress versus perfection, and progress enables change. We've got a second question then as well. Thank you, Melvin, for your inputs, your insights, and your honesty around it's never done, right? The job is still continuous and ongoing as we iterate. But we've got a question then for you, Charmaine, from a Cisco perspective. Given that you operate in 48 countries, I'm still in awe. What was the toughest market to break into as Cisco?
That's a very good question. I generally tend to personally travel to each and every one of the countries. And the difference is not really in terms of breaking into the markets. The challenge comes, I think, around partnerships. I believe that because we have such a solid sort of footprint across these various countries, it's only because of the value of the partnerships. I think Melvin also touched on it, just in terms of who you're going in with, who stands quite credibly with you, and also the people that we have on the ground in terms of these different markets. That's always quite essential. And the good thing is, Joe, the reason why something like a Cisco Networking Academy becomes so important and why it's so credible for many of the individuals who take it up is because I think 96% of students actually globally say that having taken up Networking Academy, it's made a positive impact in terms of their lives, and they're using these skills in their daily sort of jobs. And also they say that, you know, whatever they've learned, 92% of these students are saying, I can actually apply it to my current job and even for future skills. And I believe governments are starting to recognize this. Governments are starting to see that redirecting digital acceleration and adoption is quite crucial. And I must also be honest, I think the question is quite valid because our entry into these markets were also eased because of the pandemic. You've seen the joke online that says it's not the CIO, the CEO, the COO
Yes.
that accelerated digital adoption. It's actually the pandemic. And for us, that actually was the case. You know, we had to transition 75,000 workers overnight online, quite successfully, I must say. We transitioned all 75,000 of us overnight, and it worked perfectly for us because of the collaboration technology that we use. And so governments recognize that and they saw that. And I think that's actually something that has given us a seat at the table in these countries because of the value that citizens are seeing from these courses and from actually ensuring that it can be included in their daily lives.
I really like how you've described that and the frankness that, you know, COVID nudged us. I suppose it brings to mind the analogy of skydiving, where you've done all the training, you've got a parachute, someone has checked it, they know that it works, you've done the testing, the people that have given you the lessons, etc. As you go up in the airplane have done the safety checks. But if the instructor is not there to push you out of the airplane, so many of videos, because everyone takes the videos of them trying to jump out the plane, you can see people heading out and then trying to dive back in. And I'd like to think that COVID is that instructor that pushed us all out of the airplane to try something different or to really leverage what we had developed, but trust in it more from a tech perspective and digital savviness in that bucket. I see you're nodding there, Jola. The next question, interestingly enough, is for you, off the back of that. So we're going to bring it up from a Google perspective and your experience shared. I love this. I think it's always the case between Siri, Google, Alexa, etc. It says Google sees and hears so much. Which story has resonated most with you, Jola? What makes you want to actually do more?
There's so many stories, I must say. But there's one story that I can never forget. It's a story of this young lady called Ada. That basically started off digital skills training. So she did a digital skills training, and then she went ahead and did some developer courses, some Google developer courses, and she basically 10x'd her income from just doing that. Like literally, like I know this person, like I met her in person. She 10x'd her income, completely changed her life. We did a story on her, actually, it's on YouTube. And the reason why I can never forget the story is because Ada is every girl on the street. Every girl that thinks that they cannot, first of all, the technical skills are not for them. Second of all, she's also married, by the way, and she has a kid. She's married with a husband. That also there's so many cultural barriers to them kind of reaching their potential at their highest selves. And Ada is really that example of, you know, breaking all those barriers. Right, of like, you know, women picking up the right skills, women reaching for their dreams, and women really actually contributing significantly to household incomes. So for me, that one I can never forget, because also that really, really shows, you know, the potential of, you know, people, you know, just developing their digital skills and what they could become, be it an Ada or be it a John or a Guy or anyone else.
I love that. The fact that actually it's the everyday human being. What is it? It's only impossible until it's done, as Mandela said. And I think what we don't do is we don't share enough stories, right? We don't share enough pieces. They were saying statistically that South African entrepreneurs, if try once, and 1 in 3 fail, then they stop. Whereas in the US, they'll try 3 times and you keep going. And I think that's the lesson about, we call it failing forward, or rather at least progress in the space, is that if we give that environment and you share more stories of those 10x pieces realized versus, you know, the potential to be 10x, I think that sparks a whole different commitment to doing what we can do differently across the continent. So thank you so much to the 3 of you. Please stay online. We'll bring you back in for a few questions a little bit later. Actually, I had one more, if I may, and I think that is a last minute, just on your side. Just your piece, Melvin, in terms of Go One, because you operate in Africa and in Europe and across the region. Not the most difficult country to break into, etc., but maybe the most meaningful so far of the jurisdictions you've been in. And when I say that, on your road to $1 billion, where have you gained the greatest traction, the fastest? Because I love the challenge of Africans challenging Africa to unseat someone in first place in terms of the number of courses people have completed. So which country have you had the most impact in so far?
Yeah, it's an interesting one where, look, obviously, how does one measure impact? And I think I want to draw on a similar story to Jola. So, when you began the business, online, you set up your storefront. In the digital world, you can't determine who comes to your storefront or not. Your store's there, you paid your rent, and now anyone can access it. And I mean, 2 examples. So, it began, one, with the inbound inquiry, probably 3 years back, around the use of our platform to skill people in the public sector. And we hadn't done any work at that point in the public sector. And essentially was an inquiry from the Malaysian government. And I guess essentially, again, never marketed in Malaysia at the time. Look, now I've got a team there, but at the time didn't have anything. And just being able to partner with the government and actually ended up skilling all of their civil servants over a 2-year program around digital skills, thinking about the future, Blue Ocean strategy. And so again, it speaks to the point of how, if you shop every single day and put your best foot forward, but more importantly, tell the stories of how your solution or your product is actually helping people unlock that potential, you're able to attract others. And I think for me, why I think that's the most impactful, and a similar one is where we find ourselves today. Probably today, I'd argue, I think the last number we checked was, 4 in every 5 teachers in certain states in Australia use the Go One platform to do their compliance training every year, because Australia is very regulated around like how you are with kids and being child safe and so forth. And again, it's not that we essentially set out to create a very large platform for teacher training or a very large platform for public sector training, but it's about saying how, to your point earlier, how do we make sure that we keep the main thing, and focus on our products? And I think for us, that's where we have the greatest impact. It's almost the markets where we don't actively market. I mean, we do lots of work in South Africa and in the US and other markets, but more so where by just doing what you do daily, you discount who else is watching what you're doing and also getting value from doing so.
Thank you. And I think that's a great note to take a brief break on, because one of the things you talked about there, Jola, you raised it as well, so did you, Charmaine, in terms of the connectedness across the region, is almost the law of attraction, right? That philosophy that says positive thought, and in your case, the positive things you've done bring positive results. And as a consequence, you've almost brought people into the circle unintentionally. And that speaks volumes, because then they've stepped in. And when that happens, I think the ripples start in a new pond. So well done. Thank you so much for unlocking education. As I said, stay online. We'll bring you back in at the end. I'm going to give everyone until the hour, until 10 o'clock, just a 3-minute leg stretch. For those of you that have quick calls to make, now's the time. We'll see you back soon. Thank you so much. Good morning again, and welcome back to our Africa panel on the 1st of August. And for those of you that have just joined us, welcome to a new month. So reflecting on what could be done, what has been done, and what is being done by Africans to uplift Africa and beyond, I think the one thing we can see off the back of the stories that Melvin shared for Go1 and the ripple effect beyond the continent, as well as what Cisco has been doing across the region, if we think about NetAcad and over 2,000 centers, and what Google is doing in its drive to 10 million people, and I think Google Hustle speaks volumes. In fact, we're living the SDGs. And if I think about a few off the back of education and the first few speakers we had that shared their stories, goal number 4, which is quality education, comes to mind as being driven quite hard. Goal 5 on gender equality, we heard about the programs linked to women initiatives and specifically SMEs and enablement. Goal 8 on decent work and economic growth, the opportunity these platforms have to harness what is available to create new roles, new jobs, literally new opportunities and better livelihoods is evident. Goal 9 on industry, innovation and infrastructure, the learning colleges being built that created the rule of 3 in terms of different levels of employment and impact in each of the economies across the continent. Then specifically, I love goal 17, and that's to touch on a few, right, off the back of what we've just heard, is its partnerships to achieve these goals. And all of these organizations and the individuals that have just spoken do this as a collective to make a difference. And so if you equipped the continent with the right tools for people to empower themselves from an education and financial freedom perspective, we really see how critical that is for Africa and what our possibility realized can look like. So we've talked a lot about education. Now it's about financial inclusion, or rather, inclusive finance. The World Bank's definition of financial inclusion means that individuals and businesses have access to useful and affordable financial products and services that meet their needs. Transactions, payments, savings, credit, insurance. Actually, to be frank, financial services is a noble profession. If banks really get this right, they are market makers, market shapers. If insurance companies get it right, they keep your world together when it falls apart. So they protect and grow your assets in that bucket. And so as a collective, financial services delivered in all forms, and we've seen a number of new players to the market, if done responsibly and sustainably, make the world of difference. So financial inclusion not only then strengthens the availability of economic resources, but it is really key to understanding the concept of saving, not only amongst the poor, but amongst many. It's a major step towards financial resilience and inclusive growth. It helps in the overall economic development of an individual, a community, and society. And so with that, we have our very own Carney partner, Hintus Honeyball, who heads up financial services with deep industry experience, not only in assisting prominent financial institutions, but also for new players and new incomers to the industry to deliver very much not only on what is next, but what is actually needed. So Hintus, you and I have had long, passionate conversations about financial inclusion or inclusive finance and enabling the sector to do what is essentially right. Why is this even more important now than it ever was before? And once in place, what's the real impact it could have? Over to you.
Hey, Joe, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Just a welcome to the audience from my side. It's a true privilege to share some experiences with you. I think, Joe, the first thing to notice is that where we deal with clients across the world, we're currently in discussions with clients in Europe, Asia, Malaysia, Africa, South America. Financial inclusion is a topic that gets asked everywhere. It's a common problem, specifically in developing economies. And part of our role is to see how do we learn from different territories and bring it back to Africa so that we can roll it out faster, roll it out more successful, and overall be more focused on targeted on what we do. Just as an objective, so financial inclusion, and it links to the strategy, to the objective of the World Bank's definition of financial inclusion that you've just shared. The objective of financial inclusion is effectively to remove barriers that excludes people to participate in financial sectors. And at the same time, it is to improve their lives. Now, that is key, because if we do something and we don't have a positive outcome, then we've got to really ask the question, why? So I want to share a couple of statistics in terms of how financial inclusion have improved people's lives, and at the same time from a GDP perspective. But more importantly, financial inclusion will enable 7 of the 17 sustainable development goals that you've just touched on. 7 of them will be achieved by focusing on financial inclusion. So I think that justifies a fair amount of effort that we should place on this. So if we look at a practical example, so the World Bank Group consider financial inclusion a key enabler, like we've said, to reduce extreme poverty. Now, a very good example of that is Kenya. So by improving the financial inclusion in the Kenyan economy, their GDP have risen by 30%. Now, for the rest of the world, if we target, and if we listen to the economists, they get pretty excited about a 2 or a 3% growth in the economy. However, if we can achieve, 30% is very good. Let's say we can achieve 15%. Then even so, this becomes a very, very prominent topic we need to address. So a couple of statistics that I just want to share to set the scene. More importantly, if we look at the ownership of accounts worldwide, between 2011 and 2021, the increase in accounts have gone up from 51% to 76%. So that's worldwide, a significant take-up. Now, something must have been driving that. So if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, that in 2021, only 55% of adults actually had a bank account. So that leaves a massive amount of transactions that are happening in economies that are not part of a formal system, pretty much cash-driven. If we look at the impact of mobile money, of the 55% accounts and the adults, 33% of them had a mobile money account. So the ability to reach people through the expansion of mobile networks, the internet, is a key enabler for financial inclusion. And the two run hand in hand. If we look at COVID-19, COVID was a burning platform, and it created a massive uptick in digital payments, as an example. So interestingly enough, 18% of adults made some of their first digital payments during the timeline of COVID. So as a burning platform and for financial inclusion and including or expanding the digital payment side of things, it's done fantastically well. If we look at some of the developing economies, that 39% of adults are included in the digital side of the economies, and 57% of those economies find that adults open their first bank account when they receive their first wage or the salary, and more importantly, or a grant from government. So in a lot of these success stories, governments have been driving and pushing the underbanked or the unbanked to say, we'll give you the grants, but you've got to open up a digital account. Now that brings the question about of saying, but don't people just withdraw all the money at once if it is paid into account? And in most cases, that is still true. However, there is a responsibility, and interestingly enough, this leads to education, where we're saying we have to educate, and the first-time bank account owners needs to be educated as to how a bank account works. We've also found that digital literacy is a stumbling block, definitely. And at the same time, the education component around banking per se, to say, will banks treat me fair? Are they going to take my money or not? Is another education component that we need to consider. So in conclusion, we effectively need purpose-driven actions, and we need alignment between all the stakeholders in order to include or to increase financial inclusion.
Thank you, Hentus. And I think the statistics almost speak for themselves. Basically, to include everybody in society, access to financial services, regardless of income and savings, is really important. So it's a very different construct. And you said something interesting around going out, coming back into Africa and sharing what's been learned. But the one thing around that is actually the opportunity to export what we are going to be doing here locally on the continent into the rest of the world. Because I think our pressure points and often the best innovation is born out of a pain point. We're probably really well positioned, given the statistics you mentioned earlier, to come up with what that could look like going forward. And so I think we've benchmarked ourselves against slower growth often, right? So we're doing well if we're beating the world powers in terms of where they be. But should we maybe benchmark ourselves against quantum growth? We've got different opportunities that Africa has to offer and possibly underplay ourselves when we pitch too low. So this is impacted by a couple of things, right? The interplay between customers, financial institutions, the regulators. How could we maybe show up differently to really leverage that difference between the 15% and the 30% you mentioned earlier in terms of what that opportunity holds for the continent and beyond?
It's a good question, Joe. And I'd start by saying that the one thing that we have seen in Africa is that we've got a tendency to quantum leap adoption. Our adoption rate of technology is very, in fact, it's probably the highest in the world. I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think it is very, very high compared to the rest of the world. Importantly is we are quite unique in the way that we engage. Our infrastructure is a bit of a challenge compared to other places in the world. So innovation is something that we have to deploy, and we have to create the partnerships that you mentioned earlier to make sure that we provide the infrastructure and the mechanism for people to motivate for financial inclusion. So if I can, interesting fact around this, to talk about partnerships. If we look at the World Bank definition you read earlier around financial inclusion, they talk specifically about useful products, affordable products. They talk about financial services to meet the needs, whether it's a business or an individual. And then they mention the products. They talk about payments, savings, credit, and insurance. I think the interesting perspective here is that the definition might be the same for the regulator, for the bank, and for the consumer, because they all want that. But the way they measure it is very different. So what it means to the three individual institutions is a challenge. Now, that's where the partnership needs to come in. So if we look at partnership and we say, right, from a regulatory perspective, they're looking at mitigating risk. Now, the question is, if I bring in a huge amount of unbanked individuals with low income into the system, is that increasing my risk or not? From a bank's perspective, the bank ultimately still needs to run a profitable business. If I bring these lower income earners into my bank, am I going to jeopardize my risk or increase my risk rather? Am I going to jeopardize income? And then from a consumer perspective, he's saying, can I trust anybody in this system? So there's definitely misalignment between the three of them. However, that requires a partnership where we drive towards a common objective. It also requires us to fundamentally rethink the values that we are trying to drive when we talk around financial inclusion. So as an example, how we measure and what we measure needs to change. Traditionally, we found that financial institutions would measure a person on his net worth. Does he have a salary? And does he have any assets? Now, a lot of the work we're doing at the moment, we are moving away from that concept by rather focusing on the individual's behavior. So it becomes a behavioral credit model and not a financial or an asset model. Personally, I've been involved in discussions in rural areas where there are very successful business people still working largely on cash. If they go to a traditional bank, they can't get a loan. Yet there are institutions that are providing finance to them, and it is a very good business for them. So there's a huge informal sector that we probably need to visit and say, because if we tackle the SME businesses in the informal sectors and we can make them part of the financial system, let's call it with more success, we will bank the downstream individuals as well. So financial inclusion becomes a function of practicality and more around the individual and not so much around the business objectives. That ultimately will result where we get more of a systemic impact that we need to drive. And the reality is, with some of the players, we might have to lose a little bit in the short term to gain in the long term. And then very importantly, financial inclusion is not necessarily, in the modern definition, always a bank. It is anywhere where a financial transaction takes place that can be recorded and that could be digital. So there's a big drive with a lot of the economies to take cash out of society. But we can get there. We need to understand, what does financial inclusion mean? So in summary, I think for me personally, there's a couple of let's call it key principles that we need to establish. The one is, in order to drive financial inclusion, we need internet and mobile connectivity within certain regions, and it's got to be secure and it's got to be stable. We need government incentives. What can government do? Is there a world where government will grant tax incentives for banks to increase their financial inclusion? Is there a world where government will provide a closer alliance working with banks to make sure that we stimulate our economies through this? Melvin, just a hint here, financial education, very important component. And there's a fine line between financial education and trust. So we also need to understand, how do we build trust with our consumers so that the money will be safe, the transactions is secure. And then lastly, which is probably for me the most important point, as banks, as financial institutions, as regulators, we need to understand our customers better. Not just the corporates, not just the SMEs, but the rural individual, the underbanked and the unbanked as well. And that effectively becomes a data game. So we need to put a lot more emphasis on the quality of data that we can gather from our unbanked or underbanked. And how do we leverage the data to provide models? We've got to think differently. The patterns of old is not going to be relevant in the new world that we're going into. So we have to actively challenge ourselves, our thinking of how we're going to amend that. And that starts with understanding the data of the individuals so that we can not only adapt and understand their behavior, but also our own behavior when it comes to credit models, when it comes to the way we evaluate customers, and when we look at the future value, specifically from a banking perspective of individuals.
Thank you, Hentes. And I think very definitively there's a difference between willing and able to pay. And if you create from a practical perspective the ability to pay, you then reshape that. And I think you mentioned earlier COVID-19, as did Charmaine, in terms of it being a catalyst, not just for technology, but what it's pushed us to think differently about. And the one thing there is, what is it, our ROI? What are we actually looking at there? Do we have to forego some earnings when you look at traditional banking to really ensure an ecosystem survives? If you think about repayment holidays, structuring things differently, etc. And I came across a really lovely definition through a piece of brand work where they call it the ROI squared. It's return on investment plus a return on integrity. And if you combine what you have here with doing the right thing, and enabling not then just the regulators, the financial institutions, but also the customer predominantly, you can shape what the world looks like. So very exciting for that. I've got a question for you later, so please don't go far. I think you've sparked some interesting thought, and when we loop back on financial inclusion, we'll come back to you with that Q&A. As we move on to the future of banking, or rather, let's talk about the future of how we bank, which could be different, and how we transact with each other, whether that's low ops or no ops or digitally. I wanted us to talk to someone that's worked with the regulators, one of your key players in the trio you mentioned earlier. And so I'm going to bring up Nuru, and I will keep your questions for you, Hentes, for a little bit later. Nuru, welcome to the panel this morning. Good to have you on board. A couple of things. Wow. You come out of the sustainable finance and responsible investment space. You've operated Africa policy as an advisor. Very importantly, you're recognized as one of the top 25 global influencers in green finance. You've contributed to financing, and I think the word that you used, and I love it, rewiring the banking across Africa and how we think, which is very apt. When you first started, if you think back to 2008, in terms of advocating for sustainable finance, it's almost like Africa was a little bit behind the rest of the world. And I think you mentioned to me, you felt like a lone soul in Kenya at the time. And we've literally in the last 14 years seen the market shift massively. Your impact since then is evident in a couple of things. And I do want to say a shout out to you as the youngest female fellow of the Kenyan Institute of Bankers. So that's well done. While I'm doing shout outs, Kulasha Magile, you were first in the Early Bird Award. A shout out to you too. So even the small things matter when you're first and foremost. So to both of you, being forward first starters. But in the last 14 years, we've seen the landscape shift substantially. I'd love you to share a little bit more about your journey to get here, the role you saw corporates playing, the regulators and policy, to enabling the ecosystems? Because when I think green finance, I almost think renewables instantly, or I think about what it means for plants. What does it really mean from your perspective?
Thanks so much, Joe. It's really great to be here. I've learned a lot listening to all the speakers so far this morning. And really just to, if you don't mind, I'll pick up from where Hentas has left off, but I'll definitely touch on the green aspect. But since we're talking about financial inclusion, I want to just kind of show how there's that nexus between inclusion and sustainable finance and green finance. And Hentas shared some really good data that really just points to the fact that we're seeing an increasing trend in financial inclusion, and the average rate of account ownership definitely is going down. We also see that happening from a gender perspective. So generally, sub-Saharan Africa, we're very happy to see positive trends around inclusion. And we should expect to see those trends continue, more so because it is profitable for the financial sector. So when Hentas is talking about tax incentives for inclusion, I'll put a question mark there, because banks are making money from inclusion. So I'm not quite sure about the tax incentive part, but I see the point. I totally understand the point. So really, when it comes to financial resilience, and resilience being our ability to withstand shocks, right? From an Africa perspective, we still have a very large population that's financially fragile. So to me, coming to your question, Joe, to me, this issue of financial inclusion and resilience can only go so far. And we really need to pay attention to two emerging threats that I would call threats. And from a policy perspective, I would call them threats. And those two emerging threats are one that you talked about, climate change and the whole green economy and the transition to net zero, that being the first. And the other threat being the fourth industrial revolution. And again, the speakers have talked about this. They've talked about the large informality bias that we have generally in our African economies. We are largely manual. And when COVID happened, it shone a light and reminded us how largely informal our sectors are. So when you talk about financial inclusion, and I'm glad that Hentas said, financial inclusion just doesn't happen in banks, for example. Financial inclusion happens at the point of transactions. So when COVID happened, for example, we saw economies shut down. We were told to stay home for 2 weeks, and almost overnight, traders, for example, the trader that Theo talked about, this lady, the shea butter seller, almost overnight, customer bases are wiped out. You don't have access to commerce. You don't have access to markets. So really, that's how you can see why this issue and that nexus between inclusion, resilience, and digitization is a key thing. So I would say, for me, where I come from and what I'm looking at, my point of view really is looking at inclusion, resilience, and the two key threats being the fourth industrial revolution and the net zero transition.
And I think, Nuru, so true. Everyone's talked about it and done a lot in the talking space, and it's top of mind. And we've seen Africa catch up, I think, to where the world was or is, and possibly we can look at leapfrogging that, as Hentas mentioned. Maybe you can give me an example of when you first, because this is a calling to a large degree in terms of the impact you make and what you do. And when you first started in corporate, the reaction of corporates to this versus your pivot into the regulatory space and why that happened, because your story is encouraging around when you possibly hit a first obstacle, because different things are important for different people at different stages, how to make sure you don't just succumb to that and become part of the ecosystem as opposed to shaping the ecosystem.
Yeah. So I think for me, why I pivoted from, I used to work at Barclays. So why I pivoted from working in the sector to really moving towards policy from an industry perspective, and now I'm on policy from a regulatory perspective, is because I believe that policy is the linchpin, if you will, when it comes to really anchoring some of the market practice that we are seeing. I'll give you an example, Joe. When COVID happened, and I know I keep talking about COVID, but COVID really is the lesson. And you talked about this is that 100-year mark. And there's lots of lessons in COVID that we should never forget, and we need to learn from. So one of the learnings from COVID that I picked up on was really how governments needed to deploy the social safety net money to their citizens. And a lot of the developing countries struggled, again, because of that informality bias. So really just looking at, okay, how can we structure, leveraging on the financial sector, leveraging on mobile money, which really Africa is ahead of the world when it comes to financial innovation from a mobile perspective. I think Africa is really the head of it, and we thank M-Pesa and many other fintechs that have followed through on underpinning that. So when governments were trying to deploy that capital, they were not able to identify the citizens who needed that money. World Bank had a very interesting study that found over 100 million sub-Saharan Africans did not have an ID. So when it came to access, and inclusion is about access, it's about suitability, but when it came to access, these individuals were off grid. So really, from me, my passion and why I'm really passionate about sustainable finance from a policy perspective is policymakers are beginning to come alive to the fact about that interlinkage that I'm talking about between inclusion, resilience, technology, and climate. And indeed, when I first started having these conversations, I felt like a Lone Ranger, Joe, in Kenya, and it was at a time when most financial institutions were just basically focused on the P&L. But over the years, we are seeing more policymakers really start putting the pieces together. These governments who have social safety net programs that they need to deploy, responding to issues around, again, the net zero transition and making sure SME sectors, for example, are still able to access the global market that's shifting to zero and low carbon, right? And to me, I think net zero probably is the next COVID for the SME sector, right? So how do you make sure that from a policy perspective, market perspective, that there's some alignment that ensures there's financial innovation happening, there is inclusion happening, and more so that there is sustainable development happening? So I think I would say that, or I don't know.
No, you've answered my question, and there are a couple more in the chat, so we'll bring you back in the Q&A. But I think what's important there that you've mentioned, and hence called deliberate as well, it speaks to Jola's earlier piece around if you don't intentionally include, you unintentionally exclude. And we've got that coming up and up again. I love a comment from one of our studio, one of the online participants. So Mavis, you've done research on developing financial confidence index. And it was interesting in the note that the continued systemic exclusion that creates almost a spiral of self-exclusion. So if you don't understand it, you're not aware, etc., what does it mean? And that particular piece still sees low financial literacy for women. And especially when you talk about policy, not just the financial sector and what it does, but the impact of marriage contracts, all of those when it comes to financial resilience, right? There are pieces that are unique and nuances per market that I think are not always understood. When we say off-grid in South Africa, and earlier you would have experienced some load shedding with our technical issues, we mean we almost self-sustain our power. When you say off-grid, you've got 100 million people with no ID. They are almost invisible. And when we say net zero, imagine the world was net zero to invisibility, and you allow people to be heard, seen, banked, educated. So I love your interplay: inclusion, resilience, technology, climate. We've got a couple of questions for you. Do not go far, Nuru.
I'm not very far.
Words on? Good, great.
Yeah.
And I suppose that, do you anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I think as much as there are challenges, I think there's still opportunities. And I like what Hent has talked about, learning and leapfrogging, learning from other markets and leapfrogging. And I think, again, from a policy perspective, there's lots of opportunities for us to learn from. I've been studying several markets, and I think Asia is probably the region we as Africa need to look at a little bit closer. You're finding policymakers are really being more purposeful in creating ecosystems, digital ecosystems that now start helping transition their market from being informal to being quasi to being formal. So a lot of our brothers and sisters in trade are either completely informal or they're quasi-informal. They have a registered business, but maybe they don't file their taxes, maybe they don't keep their records properly. So that's your quasi-informal. So you find, if you look at what's happening in Asia, you're finding a movement to set up digital ecosystems underpinned by finance, right? So how do you bring traders together, provide that payments infrastructure, and there is also the aspect of climate as well, and good examples including Alibaba partnering in Malaysia with the digital free trade zone, which is quite a remarkable case study to look at in terms of policy, financial services, and markets, access to markets. Because to me, inclusion is not an means to an end. It's because people want to trade, they want to buy a home, they have education, they have health bills. So I think we need to look at the end game. What do customers want that money for? And creating that ecosystem to enable that.
And I think to your point, they're not a finite number of players anymore, right? It's an infinite number of players, and as a consequence, things change. How you engage, how you interact, the rules of the game. But what you do, I think what underpins it is, yes, the financial piece you've mentioned, the data interplay that Hent has mentioned, and an important word that has come up in each of the scenarios around trust. You're creating an ecosystem that is trusted. And so we are doing it with your peers, and you're all playing in that space. It's a different element around what's possible as a collective. Love that. The opportunity, calling all policymakers and all those who can influence policy to bravely pivot and step forward. We'll bring you back on now, Nuru. So thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Then moving into the banking. So we've had what possible, we've had policymakers around making it possible. And now we're going to talk to Abimbola, who has 2 decades in financial services, the head of corporate and sustainability and ESG at Alat, which is behind Wema Bank. And I think what's really important is she's been at the forefront of driving inclusive socioeconomic initiatives with a focus really on how we improve, which we've talked about, the youth, so the future of what that looks like, the previously excluded, so women in that bucket. And I think, Abimbola, you've had the pleasure of working with several of the panelists that we've met today. And so on the back of the work that they've done in conjunction with what you're doing, the question we need to ask ourselves often is, are we on track? Are we really making progress towards where we want to go? And I think the stories that you shared with me around what Wema Bank is doing through some of your programs, where you do see the customer, the community, the bank, all impacted in that interplay to contribute to a much more inclusive, caring specifically, and sustainable financial world, through supported behavioral change. I think to the scorecards that Hent has mentioned around how we look at people differently based on how they act comes through here. Please tell us more about some of the programs that you've helped drive and implement specific to these things.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning once again to everyone. You know how it is today, collaboration is key. And so we've had privilege of working with Google at some point with Jola. I spoke on a platform with Nuru on making finance work for Africa, looking at the gender perspective. And I like all of the things I've been sharing this morning. Particularly, I like the fact that we're placing education ahead, as in it's actually very important. Even with inclusion, if there's no education, there's no way they're going to get it done. For us at Wema, let me start with Alat, because you mentioned Alat. Alat is actually first fully digital bank in Africa. We thought about it at Wema, that how do we include everyone? How do we bring everyone on board? And looking at Nigerian demographic, you know, 70% of our population that are like the youth, they're people within 18 to 25. How do we bring them into the financial services sector? How do we grow this sector of our economy, and how do we bring more people on board to actually enjoy financial services? I know you've heard from Entus, you've heard from Nuru, financial inclusion, about affordability, about availability, accessibility, and the usefulness as well. So we thought, how do we use human-centered design to come up with solutions, working with young people, using design thinking to formulate what they need, how they need it, where they are, how to reach them at the point of need. And because we're a bank, we can't do it all alone, so we need to collaborate with a lot of people. So we work with a lot of startups actually to provide solutions. And so not just solutions around banking, we look beyond banking. And so we thought about what are the things that affect our society in terms of health, in terms of education, and more recently in terms of power. So energy from the grid is a big deal to us, and climate change is also a big deal as well. And so looking at getting fossil fuel, the crisis in Europe, adaptation and mitigation, there are a lot of things happening now. So how do we provide solutions? And those are the kind of things that we looked at WEMA. So let me backtrack a bit and go to how we actually worked with a lot of startups in terms of financial inclusion. And so we brought a lot of young minds together. What are the issues that we have in different areas? The number of fintechs in Nigeria, and the government is also trying to improve financial inclusion. As we speak today, I think we still have just achieved about 64%, and we're trying to get to 95%. So how do we achieve that? What do people need at different stratas? So is it level 1, level 2, level 3? So level 1 is basically, I just need an ID to have a bank account. So you create a wallet for the person, and they're able to access financial services anywhere they are across the country. So we worked with young minds. So they went out. We did, like I mentioned, we used design thinking approach. So what do they need in this area? What segment of the population will require these sort of services? What would a woman need? What would a micro SME person need? What would a teacher need? What would somebody in tech industry need? So we design solution customized for each of these segments using these young people, and we back them with the required resources, both financial and non-financial, and also providing them with mentors. And for some of them, we took the product a step further. And so some guys developed a solution called Side Hustle, which is targeted at women. And so this can be really useful during COVID. I know Nuru has mentioned a lot about COVID. And so during COVID, a lot of people could not access the market. They couldn't go out to actually showcase what they have, sell to people. So what they did is to use WhatsApp. So with WhatsApp, you promote your product. You can pay for your service on WhatsApp using the payment gateway that we've actually developed in-house. Advertise your product, reach more people, develop an ecosystem where people can actually access your product, access what you have, and then market side things are booming. So you find out a lot of women that actually retail products are now selling more than even when they were in their shops, because we were able to access and able to see. Then we looked at the logistics issue as well, connect them with the right ecosystem for packaging, for delivery, for recording, and all of those things. And there are testimonials around this, and people were actually excited. Another good testimony I would like to share is around one of the startups that we supported as well, called SosoCare. SosoCare is into healthcare, and they now also collaborated with one of the health management organizations called IGI. So what do people do? They pick up recyclables, and with this, we're actually protecting the environment, like climate change and all of those things. So there's like a big nexus, and it's also still women that is in this sort of stream. So what they do is to pick up recyclables, plastics, cartons, paper, and bundle it together, deliver it to the SosoCare site. They weigh it. Once it's being weighed, they tell you the value. You earn a point. Once your point gets up to 5,000 naira, you're able to access healthcare. And it was a big deal during COVID. And so the healthcare is actually it's remote. You speak with an agent online. You tell you what you want, and if they need to deliver drugs or some other medicals to you, they come to you. They deposit it. But the thing is, the women were happy that they were able to pay for their health care for both the mother and the child at cost, at zero to nothing, because they're just recyclables to sort out these problems. You can imagine what more we can do if we keep thinking in this route. And there's a more recent one that we did. I'm sure we're all aware. In Nigeria, we really don't have the right infrastructure for power. And power from the grid is difficult. So we have a startup that actually just developed a solution called Coda Embedded. So what does Coda Embedded do? What they do is to bring in solar panels, deploy it to the market areas or people that have retail businesses, and they provide power to them at the minimal cost. So it's more like pay as you use, power as a service. So whatever you consume is what you pay for. And half the time, there's no power from the grid. You can't attend to your customer. You can't run your businesses. And so for as low as 2,000 naira, and that's about $5 in a month, you have access to power. So you can imagine what that would do to a particular business at any point in time. They're able to sustain their business, able to like move their business. And at the same time, you have low emissions because you're not using a generating set where you have to use diesel to power the generator, and you have a lot of fumes around, which is both hazardous to our health and also to the community as well. You can see that there's a big nexus with innovation, financial inclusion, and also climate change. And that's what we're actually working on at Wema Bank, and that's what we're actually hammering on what our vision is: empowering lives through innovation. So vision cut across different spheres and things that we do. Thank you, Joan.
So, first of all, I love the fact that you've got the enablement through Side Hustle. I think if you connected Side Hustle with a Google Hustle, you've got an education plus a business opportunity. The pieces around education and youth, I think the average age of youth or the population in Nigeria is 18.1 years. So what that means around the opportunity to leverage the Go One platform or banking. If I think to Melvin, there's a call to action. And just from an infrastructure perspective around some of the stuff Cisco does and what you're trying to enable. The one thing that resonated with me when we spoke the first time at Ebola, and I really loved this, is you spoke about the vernacular. And when we discussed International Women's Day at Carney, one of the key pieces was how do you lift the lid on the vernacular? And you've got an amazing neonatal kind of construct. Would you tell that story? I think it would resonate with so many around the Nigerian population, what it's like outside of Lagos, and what that's meant for 1 in every 10 mothers.
So I recall a conversation, and I told a story, and which I've actually not even shared now. One of the startups told a story about how the sister actually passed on in the course of having a baby, and so the startup is called Natal Cares. It's actually online. You can look them up. So the lady was about to have a baby, and there was no healthcare facility or support to actually help, and she passed at the point of giving birth to a baby, and it was just for simple reasons, because there was no support in bringing out the baby. Number two, there was no support, even the cost of antenatal cares, and so there was nobody telling them these are the things I need to do, these are the things I need to be aware of, these are the doctors. And so what they've gone ahead to do is provide a solution that can actually meet mothers and at their own end. So they have solutions both in the local language. So we have 3 languages in Nigeria. You have the Yoruba, Hausa, and the Igbo. So what they've done is to provide solutions that can actually communicate with these women in those local languages, and they're able to understand the healthcare that they need at any point in time during pregnancy and at the point of having the baby. And so what Natal Care is, so they have this on a digital device. You can interact with the doctors, the local doctors. They have birth attendants as well. They'll help you to bring out the baby, and all you need to put out aside in Nigerian naira is about 400 naira, which is less than $1 as we speak today. Put it aside as your delivery for the money for your delivery kits, so that when you're having your baby, you are having it in a Nigerian place. You already understand the process as well. So even when you're working with a local birth attendant, because you don't have a doctor, you know what to expect, and you can guide the person through. And they can speak to you in your local language, be it Yoruba, be it in Hausa, be it in Igbo, and tell you the processes that you need to do using your phone. You know what the power of digital can do to you. And this has actually helped so many lives and actually helped with so many babies, bringing up babies in a Nigerian form, and they are not having some form of infections or even jaundice. A lot of babies that they have then usually have jaundice. And back then, 1 in every 5 kids that they have usually die. But now it has reduced significantly. And so with Natal Cares, they are doing a lot. They've got a lot of funding from international parties, and they also got people supporting them in terms of using the crowdfunding platform. So as an individual, I can say, oh, I want to support Natal Cares with just 5,000 naira, which is about $10 on a monthly basis, so you can keep bringing healthy babies to the world and supporting the mothers as well. And so this is a big deal for us because invariably we're protecting lives, we're improving lives and impacting lives as well, because even the doctors, the local vet attendants can easily now get to learn more through the doctors that they're working with and now protect the community that is serve us. So a lot more is happening, and this is done through collaboration. And so it's not just us as a bank, it's not just the startups, they also work with other individuals and all some manufacturing companies, such as the ones that produce hygiene products and to help bring babies to life. So a lot is happening in this fair, and we believe that with more collaboration, we'll get more done.
Thank you so much. And I think, first of all, as a mother of four, this resonates on so many levels, but you've epitomized the fact that it's almost the emergent theory, the bottom up, everything's come together to make a difference. It speaks to some of Nuru's pieces that you spoke about earlier around policy, but actually epitomizes the fact that we're better together, and that the financial system in and of itself can not only protect its existing customer base, formalize what is informal, which has been done here, but also make sure that there's an opportunity for a future customer base. And I think, Nuru, you put it quite aptly around, it's profitable to do the right thing. And I think hence is looking at it with a lens around how do we leapfrog is obvious in that bucket. So thank you very much. The first time when we spoke, those stories not only warmed my heart, but it made me look at banking with a different lens in terms of the art of the possible, but also doing what matters most and makes a difference. I've got a couple of very interesting questions for you from the audience. And I'm going to start with you, Nuru, just in terms of the first one that's come up, because it's quite tricky and it's interesting given the manual approach to banking in a number of instances across Africa, and building this up post-COVID. If we look at what the technology framework looks like, it's really important because there are a lot of small businesses that died because they weren't set up digitally. There is a big gap that lends this itself to a lot of cyber attacks. So maybe talk through that fact. Tell us, how do we try and close that gap between a manual Africa banking system and what we need to do to be digitally, not so much savvy, but actually to survive and then thrive? That digital lens is critical.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I came up with this phrase, COVID Kairos. And Kairos is a window of opportunity. You'll find it in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. And it talks about this divinely appointed time. And I think we are in a Kairos because of COVID. We have witnessed rapid automation and digitization and even a change in culture, how we act, how we behave. McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group have done lots of studies over the past 2 years that just found that financial sector consumers, banking, insurance consumers who would never use exclusively digital platforms, maybe because of trust or no access, now are using these platforms and they don't plan to go back post-COVID. So hence the window of opportunity, right, for policy, for market, to really underpin technological innovation and digitization. Because one of the pieces of work I'm doing is advising the IFC Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, and SBFN is a grouping of about 43 countries, primarily in the global south, and it's financial sector regulators and industry associations. And what we found is that as you promote financial innovation, promote financial inclusion, you can actually contribute to sustainable economic development. So to me, I think it's really just looking at, and I saw a question about what would you do if you're a minister of finance? And really, I think it's the point that we mentioned earlier, this issue about really addressing the informality bias and addressing the low levels of digitization or the manual nature of how we do things. And to me, I think the linchpin is really just trying to find just innovative ways of creating digital ecosystems. We've talked a lot about women and traders, but I'll be remiss if I don't talk about the PWD community, the persons with disabilities. We have approximately about 80 million Africans who are living with a permanent disability or temporary disability. So when you think about the disability community on the continent, from an inclusion perspective, and once you start thinking about technology and innovation, you realize that there are opportunities, Joe, and profitable opportunities in inclusion. So 80 million Africans are PWDs, and chances are they do not have access to quality financial services, whether it's banking or insurance or even just basic savings products. And that market is basically the size of South Africa and Zambia combined. That's a huge market that's excluded just because of their disability or what we think is a disability, right? But at the same time, I was part of an interesting project before I left the Kenya Bankers Association. And we did a study within several banks to see what their inclusivity is from a PWD perspective and how their systems perform if you have a disability. And it was such an eye-opening experience. But here was the interesting thing. When you design for inclusion and PWDs, you actually radicalize your culture and you promote innovative practices that will help the whole of the bank, the rest of the bank, right? So it's not just about creating products that are inclusive for women, creating products that are inclusive for PWDs and thinking it stops there. It's not a silo. When you start promoting financial innovation, as I mentioned earlier, you promote sustainable development because you then borrow those efficiencies and you learn from those efficiencies, you gain from those efficiencies at the same time. So to me, I think, really, that's the COVID Kairos, right? The fact that as a global community, we are ready, we are accepting, and we have been primed for digital financial services.
So there's nothing like the environment giving you an opportunity that is a level playing field, right? And everyone gets to come in and catch up. And I love COVID Kairos as a takeaway piece around what this has enabled or allowed going forward. And what's interesting, you said around products from a PWD perspective with 80 million, the 1 billion learners that the Go One team must reflect, the 10 million spaces that we play in when it's a Google piece, the 2,000 different centers that Cisco has, the 1 in 5 death experience in Nigeria being turned on its head with what being done with the fintechs or the technology companies as startups being supported by a Weber Bank. Wanted to come to you then, Hentis, with what those numbers translate into as an opportunity in terms of what's the plan, if you had to think about the stuff that's being done, could be done, to reach the underbanked clients and educate them in this regard. We're not going to give away all of the secrets in the spaces, but there is an opportunity. And so what's the plan around that? Because what Noor is talking about is we're going to help groom, create, enable a quality customer because of how we bank or how we drive inclusion. Over to you.
Thanks, Joe. Just briefly, just to catch on to Nuru's point around the connectivity component and the example given around using SMSs. So what's happened is that as technology matures, there's a distinct acceleration in the speed of how solutions can be rolled out, number one. We're also finding that with the growth of newer platforms, fintech, open platforms, huge apps or big app technology being developed and deployed, the ability to roll out a combination of education and financial services become real. There's also a world when it comes back to partnering, where we have to partner with the technology players because there's benefit in it for them, but there's also benefit in for the consumers. So there's a new world being born that is effectively API open platform based, where we bring the best of technologies into an environment. We leverage familiar technologies. At the end of the day, this needs to be deployed into communities to create sustainability. If I can take small scale farming as an example, I've personally been involved in the discussions around setting up smaller cooperatives with very niche type, literally one product farmers in specific rural areas. By bringing the technology to them, you not only educate them, you not only empower them, you not only make them part of the financial system, but you also give them access to decent education to the internet. So it becomes a globalization discussion. So to answer your question in short, We have to focus on a systemic approach, which effectively enables communities that will also result in more sustainability from a livelihood perspective. We also need to focus on changing the way we think about financial services and truly understand what's the purpose of a financial transaction or a financial instrument. Through a combination of those, there's already been success stories, there's already discussions of creating those communities, whether it's in the form of a cooperative or Nuru, as you mentioned, in Asia, the systemic getting together of various people with common interests. Those are learnings that we can deploy, and it is happening now. It's just not happening enough. That's what we should be driving for.
I think the point is not that it's not there at all. It's about how do you reach all of those that are invisible, with disabilities or not, on both sides. Abimbola, I've got a question for you that's also come up, which is an interesting lens on the initiatives being taken at Wema Bank. But how has doing the right thing for your communities, your customers, Nigeria, impacted the bank's sustainability? Profitability, I suppose, is the question as well.
Yes, it's in the big way. It has actually impacted us. I was listening to Enzo talking about the farmers. So one of the startups that we worked with also designed a solution for farmers where they can actually get access to fertilizers for their farming. And with that, you also get enrolled on the health scheme as well. So the man, typically men don't like to use the hospitals, but they now get it for their wives. And so because their family is involved, they get more, they actually got more interested in onboarding onto the platform. And so it was easier to get them on board. So a lot of things are happening that way. And so I must say that we have made impacts in different ways. That some way we don't look at the financial gains now, because sustainability is long term. It's not just now, but actually, if the community is not there and if the people are not there, then the business will not be there. So some way, somewhat, we've actually made impacts in various aspects, talking about bringing financial inclusion, number one. Number two, around the health. The health is a big deal for us, and we're super proud of what our startups are doing. Now I can talk about the power solution using Kobuda embedded. And so we've made an impact in all of these areas in the bank, and we're working with a lot of stakeholders to continue to improve on what we've done and to see how much more we can do again, and to see how many other people that we can bring on board, because it's a community thing. We can't do it all by ourselves.
I love that. And I think the banker in me after 20 years in that industry says it's quite a shift from a lifetime value of customer to lifetime value for customer in the spaces. So almost a livelihood shift. I'm going to bring all the panelists up now. And then we're going to kick off with an interesting question on ESG that really piqued my interest, largely because I have now learned another new acronym in the spaces. So we'll get everyone back on. Good to see you again, Melvin. Looking forward to having Jolo back, and then Charmaine as well. So just a couple of the pieces that I think came up that are quite interesting for me is one of the questions from the audience says, the latest edition of The Economist takes a dim view of ESG and its ability to save the planet. It argues that ESG suffers from fundamental problems and that investors are now growing more skeptical. The magazine says ESG is at risk of meeting, and this is my new acronym, exaggerated superficial guff. Are there any comments from those on the panel? And I actually wanted to direct it to you, Nuru, and then bring in Melvin here, and then happy for anyone to jump in. But it's very interesting between impact investing versus ESG and what it means. We'll start with you, Nuru, and then Melvin, I've given you a little bit of time to think, and then we'll leap in with anyone that has any other comments.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of discomfort, I think, from some investors when they're seeing the funds that they're invested in, and when they start seeing the itemized list of the various companies that constitute the fund, and questions around, are some of these companies greenwashing? Some of these companies are green, but they're not ethical. So ESG is your ethics, your social, and your basically your environment, your social, and your governance, right? So from a governance perspective, perhaps these firms might not meet or align with their values, but from an environmental perspective, they're really green, they're dark green. So I think there's a lot of debate around this. I think there are many answers to this. One of it is really how the funds constitute their indices, also around the definitions, because often funds will have their proprietary methodology to identify assets, and based on that, you can't perform a like-for-like comparison across funds, hence some of the debate. To me, I think from an African perspective, we should just not get caught up with all that, right? I think we need to build our own market. I think we need to really think about, again, it goes back to the informality bias that we have. We need to build financial literacy. We need to build our local domestic capital markets. Forget how the world is defining ESG. You can borrow from it, you can adapt it, you can adopt it, all the funny, all the fancy words you want. But ultimately, we need to come up with a solution for Africa. And it starts with our capital markets, our domestic capital markets. And it goes back to inclusion, right? This shea butter lady who's selling shea butter that Theo talked about, how is she participating in the capital markets, right? And then how do we make sure we're allocating this capital to the environmental aspects that will sustainably build our economies? When you look at where a lot of the impact capital you're talking about, Joe, goes, a lot of the ESG mandates that the big funds allocate towards, oftentimes they're allocating towards assets that have inputs from these international markets. So from Sweden, from Germany, from the UK, these are their inputs. So is the money staying in Africa or going back to where it's coming from, right? So I think we really need to not get caught up in the whole, is ESG a passing trend? To me, it's not a passing trend because it's about sustainability. It's about efficiency and resilience, which is never a trend. So it's more about making sure that it's relevant in the African context, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think underneath that, the link around education and awareness. And so, Melvin, just wanted your thoughts on some of the policy and regulation as we start to drive education in the right direction. How does that tie into some of these narratives? Because often regulation starts to drive, bringing this front of mind, starts to drive the ultimate change in behavior when we ourselves don't actually self-regulate, right? So ESG is not necessarily a trend, but at least it brings into the headlines quite boldly what we should be looking for. Any thoughts on how that impacts the platform, the training that you do?
Yeah, I think two levels. I think to take a step back, I think so is ESG a panacea that's going to bring about world peace? Probably not, but it's another arrow in our quiver. And I think we also can't put too much on three letters to change the world. I think it comes down to so much more. And I think by taking that view, we're able to actually appreciate what role it plays in getting to where we want to get to. And I think the beauty of, all of us working on the continent of Africa is that arguably the best businesses and organizations are ones that are solving real problems, which actually benefit society, and I think it's something you can't take for granted. I mean, if in other markets, you can do very well solving non-core societal issues. I would argue in Africa, if you want to do particularly well as an organization, as an investor, as an individual, focus on solving the biggest problems. And in our instance, those are core societal ones. So I think ESG goes hand in hand with anyone's even direct motive, whether that's profit or otherwise. I think when you take let's say the education lens, I think, to your point around what that means for how the psyche one approaches these things with, I think it's the importance of, I think one, so ESG as a concept, let's make sure that's well understood. And I think, there are codes around ESG that focus on invest. I think, what does ESG look like for a company, for an employee, as an individual? Because it can't be limited to, yes, you can start a capital markets. What does that mean for me on a day-to-day basis? What does Marvin being a good citizen society mean? I think that's where, again, it's about almost, so my master's was in was in public policy at Oxford, and a policy to say, I'll actually say one thing, policy in every single instance. So if you want education, how are you making education relevant in your health policy? Are you making it relevant in your building policy? So for example, in Africa, if someone's going to school hungry because let's say the agricultural policy doesn't support, let's say, school schemes, there's an issue that affects core education outcomes. And I think it's about saying, how do you then take a view of ESG in every policy and every intervention? So what does that mean to be a good corporate employee, to be a good citizen in the country, to be a good company? And I think that's where, if we break it down to a more practical level, we get there. And I think education plays a role in achieving that, only because education is what bridges the divide between what you don't know and what you could know. And I think there's a good role to play there.
And I'm glad, because some of your Go One courses are accredited, right, by professional bodies. Can you tell us how many? Because I think you're going to have an onslaught of new students.
Well, look, we have over 100,000 courses and content items, so we'll welcome all onslaughts on all volumes.
I like that. And please go check. You'll see on the site the accreditation pieces. Jola, maybe coming to you then around this being part of how we do what we do and not being seen in silos, right? You're not fixing them as incremental bits in a building block, but actually they're all interconnected, which is what Melvin has alluded to so nicely around the policy link and that Nuru set up earlier. And the online learning as well that Google has, but the Hustle Academy, the couple of things you've got to bring these ecosystems together is quite remarkable around hitting that 10 million mark, now at 6.5 million already. The question is, how can that gender gap be closed though? Because how are we enabling the right people to apply for those? How do you close that gap?
Thanks for that question. So in terms of closing the gender gap, I think it's really just been deliberate. As I mentioned earlier, it's been intentional from the start in terms of like the programs, interventions, initiatives that we're developing. How are we thinking about the fact that, first of all, bold enough to acknowledging that there is a gap, and bold enough to actually also put a vision forward that actually says, you know what, we want to, like Melvin said, like we want to reach 1 billion people, but we want to do that in the most equitable way. We want to make sure that we are carrying everyone along, like people in general. So we're not trying to reach 1 billion men or 1 billion, XYZ kind of category of human beings, but we want to reach an inclusive group of people. Right. So it's really about, first of all, acknowledging the gap and also being bold enough to actually, create plans from the get-go to actually close those gaps, and working with the right data as well, and working with the right frameworks to actually know that, so for instance, if you're trying to help close the gender gap in particular, there's certain things that work for women. One of the ways that we know that women learn is that they learn in communities, they learn in groups, right? They come together. The peer-to-peer learning is a big factor in the online learning. It works for women because they have a lot of other things to juggle. And when you put them in online learning as well, you have to surround them with the right community of support. So how do you begin to build those frameworks and those foundations into the programs, initiatives that we're designing and intentionally including from the get-go? And also, how do we also measure ourselves against those results as well? So instead of us saying, for instance, we want to reach, XYZ number of people, XYZ number of people and X% of that are actually going to be women, or X% of that are actually going to be people with disabilities. Like, how do we basically, in the plan, set that aggressive or inclusive target, and how do we measure those results and not just measure broadly, and then at the end of the day it's not as inclusive or equitable?
So I like that. It's about being intentional, and that's showing up in how we behave and how we act. And I think we've talked quite a lot about the art of the possible. You've shared stories about what has been done, is being done, and the role that actually we play as a collective in the environment in terms of allowing people to be seen, to be felt, to be heard. I'd love to really see that 100 million people with no identities worked out how do we close that kind of gap in terms of reaching more people. And some of the key takeaways, before I ask you each to leave us with one of your golden nuggets, is that it takes a village, right? Collaboration, which is the new competition, right? Is what we're looking at. Is that if you don't intentionally include, and I love that you unintentionally exclude, it's the fact that we need to first understand the gap, and you've started to articulate those in actual numbers, grounded in fact, understand what that gap is, and then start to bridge the gap in terms of financial inclusion. Not necessarily close it. This is a journey, because as we evolve, so do the circumstances around us and the instances we're trying to solve for. And that education is the bedrock for economic development, for financial inclusion that we're going to build on. And so with that, I'm going to do a speed round robin of one takeaway I'd like you each to leave with our audience. Really, it's going to be about how do you inspire inclusion and spur us on in terms of what we do, either as individuals or in our companies. I'd like each of you to leave your one on the call now. And I'm going to start in alphabetical order with you, Abimbola, and then go to you, Charmaine.
like you've mentioned across the call, collaboration is key and it's important for us to move Africa forward. There are a number of things happening. So how do we all work together to ensure the right kind of inclusion in terms of education, in terms of all the indices that actually you mentioned through the SDGs? So how do we get this happen across board? So for us at WEMA, we're moving forward. We're empowering lives through innovation, working with all the necessary stakeholders to make this happen and to impact the society as well, not just the people that we actually have business.
1 second.
With. So for us,
30 seconds. I'm going to have to stop you there to get around the table.
It's fine. We're impacting lives. Come join us. Let's do it together.
Love that. Come join us. Charmaine, your quick 10 seconds.
Yeah, so I think you said it, Joe, it takes a village. And I think not one individual is going to do it. We need to collaborate. We need to partner for that scale. And clearly, by the Cisco stats, you can see that through the partnership and collaboration and going through partners, government, academia, public sector, private sector, we are achieving impact and not just the numbers. So for me, partnership, collaboration, key.
Partner for parity. I love that. All right, Hinters.
Very briefly, whether we're talking financial inclusion, education, or ESG, it's opportunities. And all of the opportunities we will leverage, but we have to think differently. We cannot think the way we used to.
I love that. Opportunity knocks, think, act differently. Jola.
Proactively, intentionally include, so you don't unintentionally exclude.
Love it. I like that. Melvin, it's you.
Simply put, and I echo what everyone else has said, but progress over perfection. I think, it's about saying, how do we in our teams, in our homes, and even in our communities, how do you make that progress against inclusion? And I think it's not about some perfection, but starting where you are. So progress over perfection.
I like that. It's the first step is the hardest. So at least take a step forward on that journey. Nuru, and you're going to round us out.
So this is how you clap in sign language, but that's not my point. My point is, I'm buying time. My point is that we have a COVID kairos. The window of opportunity has opened for digitization and also for us to significantly address issues around climate change and the net zero transition. Africa should not be left behind. Our SME sector should not be locked out of the global market. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that. I think our net zero means taking everyone with us, and we can all clap for that. I'm going to hand you back now to our host. Thank you so much for the opportunity to gather this morning. And so, Theo, over to you, and thank you too to our audience.
So how do I follow that, Joe? I mean, geez, so impressive, really inspirational. I'd like to thank the panel members once again for taking us into your confidence, actually, and sharing with us your insights. I'll be brief, Joe. I know that we don't have that much time, but I have to say these closing remarks. Firstly, Melvin, incredible work that you're doing. Your impact is incredible. We're seeing it, your business grow from strength to strength. I was super impressed by the 1.3 seconds that you mentioned, and I can't wait to engage with you. And it's less than 1 second. Charmaine, amazing footprint, amazing impact. I really love the approach, the collaboration, the partnerships, all that you've achieved on the Networking Academy. Super impressive, and I look to more from you going forward. Jola, your work with Google, impressive as well. Also, what really stood out for me, and what has been mentioned a couple of times, is if you don't intentionally include, you unintentionally exclude, and that's something that's going to stick in my mind for a long time going forward. And Nuru, as you mentioned, and I will repeat in my closing remark, that it's good business to include and to ensure that as many people are included in the financial landscape, and it's actually profitable. Actually, not something that is not that's not profitable. And then Abimbola, super impressive and super inspiring as well. I just can't even put words together to describe what you're achieving at WEMA Bank. But what really stood out for me, though, is that we've got to make sure we get the basics in place, the IDs, the training, the access, the education that we've all spoken about. I think those are the critical things that we need to get right. I would also mention, just in passing and using the platform a little bit, that there's a lot of other players that are active in the market. I'm aware of the Trade Bank, TDB, that's also looking at facilitating inclusion through blockchain and facilitating cross-border trade, which is also worthy of mention. We've also have the operating and mobile operating companies that are also quite active in trying to reduce the cost of inclusion and the cost of education by zero rating data and making sure that they bring all the various stakeholders to make it all happen. So as you can see, there's a lot happening, a lot more than I thought. And my call was to action was to everyone that's been part of this conversation is, what are you going to do going forward? Think about that, focus, and then act. Thank you.